Welcome to Financial Launchpad, a podcast designed to teach you about personal finance by starting with the basics and progressing to more complicated topics. We'll tackle a new topic every week and provide additional resources to learn even more and action items to launch your personal finance journey. I'm your host, Emily, and thank you for joining me as I discuss how much you should be investing for retirement. Now, I have to admit that this episode has been giving me a little bit of anxiety because I think that it is a slightly more difficult topic to cover. And just to recap on what we've already talked about, we talked about budgeting and emergency funds and paying off debt. And I understand that a lot of you may still be focusing on those things. And I encourage you to, continue listening to this investing series. But I know that it may not be sticking very well if this just isn't the point that you're at. And I encourage you to come back to these after you've gotten some of those squared away, because information is best absorbed, I think, when you're actually in the position to act on it. And you have your debt taken care of, you have that emergency fund, and you're like, okay, what's the next step? I think that's a good time to come back and listen to this. But I understand that even if you are ready for this, it can be a little bit of an overwhelming topic. There's a little bit of anxiety over how much to save, how much do I actually need to live on in retirement, and you're not going to have an answer that's perfect right now. It's kind of a moving target. So it's one of those things that you just keep an eye on it and you make sure, maybe yearly, that you're still on track to meet your goals. And I'll be providing some calculators to, figure out if you are saving enough and all of that. The goal is to invest at least 15% of your gross income toward retirement. That may sound like a huge number. That may not sound like a large number at all. You may already be doing that. But regardless, you need to double check with your situation. That's the 15% number is generally applied to people in their 20s, maybe early 30s. And I'm linking to a Fidelity article talking about how that target savings rate, investing rate, changes as you get older. Just because if you start later, you're going to have to save more because you simply have less time for compounding interest to work for you. And it also depends on really when you hope to retire. If you hope to retire early, that savings rate probably won't get you there. And that 15% rate does rely at least a little bit on Social Security, and there's a little bit more of how that number is generated in the Fidelity article that I really encourage you to read. But 15% is honestly the general investing advice that I hear from many different sources, with, of course, that caveat of verifying that it's okay for your personal situation. I want to clarify on what that gross income is. And gross income is what you're paid before any deductions and especially taxes are taken out. So you're aiming to invest 15% of your gross income. All right, so we already talked a little bit about savings rate and some of the targets that you should be hitting. And now I'm going to get into basically a way to calculate it. And this may just stem from the fact that I love spreadsheets and I love numbers. But I think that even if you don't love numbers and filling this out sounds terrible, I think that it'll still provide value, and I'll get into that a little bit later. And I think that this is still valuable even if you aren't necessarily investing because of the different boxes that you can fill and really just keeping track of your progress. So to start off, the documents that you should have in hand. It's easiest to start off with the previous full calendar year. So I'm recording this in 2019. Therefore, 2018 is over and done with, and it would be easy enough to calculate what these numbers are based on 2018 because the numbers aren't changing. It's done. So some documents that you should have, your W-2s, and that would be for both spouses if there's two of you. I think that the final paycheck of the year is really beneficial, but just because it has a lot of totals on it. That may also be on your W-2, but sometimes the W-2 is a little bit more annoying to read, at least for me. Any statements for retirement accounts or loans, credit cards, student loans, car loans, that sort of thing, all of that information. And for some of those, it might be They might actually have a summary sheet for the year, or you might just want to look at the first statement of the year versus the last statement of the year, because really you're looking at how much principal you paid on those loans. And also, if you have an HSA account and you want to put that in there, that would be another statement that you should have. So those are some of the documents that you should have in front of you to basically transpose those numbers into the spreadsheet. And really, it's not too hard once you have all of that assembled. Next, I want to talk a little bit about the terms that are in this spreadsheet. And I want to note that there are instructions here on this other tab down here, but I'm just getting into the calculator right now and basically walking you through those instructions while we're looking at the spreadsheet. Let's start with gross income. That's one that we hear often. That is basically your salary before any deductions are made. That would include taxes, health insurance, retirement contributions, all of those things. So that gross income is represented essentially by all of these boxes down to here. After you subtract off any investments that you've made, any taxes that were taken out, and any other deductions, that's where you're left with your net income. So your net income basically is what your paycheck is. That's what's hitting your account. From there, you will subtract off any sort of other investments that are post-tax, any Roth accounts, commonly a Roth 401k, even if that's taken out of your paycheck, that's still after tax technically. And then any Roth IRAs or any other taxable brokerage accounts that you might have. And then this is where your debt principal repayments will be listed. So that's where I was saying that even if you aren't investing, we're going to capture the amount of progress that you're making on those debt principal repayments, and that'll be located here. And then finally, consumption. What do you have left over after all of this is happening? And we'll get into that a little bit more later, but that's just basically after all of these things. So you might be wondering, okay, we talked about gross income, we talked about net income, what is this total compensation? And the purpose of this total compensation is to really capture the money that you're getting from your employer through matching programs. You know, if they're matching your 401k or if they're matching your HSA, that isn't actually included in your gross income. You know, your contributions are included in your gross income if you're contributing to a 401k or an HSA. But your employers are not. It's kind of above and beyond that. So that's why you have this total compensation up here. And this is getting into the weeds again with numbers, and I'll give warnings on that and just ignore me if you don't care about it. But if you care about the numbers, I've thought a lot about these and tried to have them make sense to me. So I just want to explain this. Generally speaking, when we're talking about that investing rate, you know, they say 15% of your gross income. There have been arguments to actually use 15% of your total compensation, essentially. I will get into exactly what the difference is between that total compensation and gross income and how the percentages differ and sort of the math behind it and how it's actually being calculated once we actually run the example. So with that out of the way, there are a few different savings rates down here. We will get to that after we have some numbers to deal with because I think that makes more sense. So here's the hypothetical situation that I've come up with. And I want to point out that this might not be that complicated to calculate for one person, but I think that balancing it between the two, like if you have two people and you're married and all of that, and you're trying to figure out what your household percent savings rate is, I think that's where this spreadsheet really comes in handy, just to make that easier. And this example will kind of exemplify that. So spouse one, they make $50,000 per year. So that's their gross income. That's what we know is coming in on the paychecks. They have, let's just start off first with that 401k. We know that they're contributing up to their max matching. And basically their employer has it structured so that if the employee contributes 10%, they will contribute 5%. So 10% of 50 grand is 5,000, and this person is contributing up into the match. So then that means that we know that the employer is contributing 2,500. All right, we've got that figured out. We also know that this person is carrying the insurance for the couple. They've decided to go with spouse one's health insurance, and they're the ones paying for the insurance. And that insurance is $3,000 per year. So that's this deduction here for healthcare. Also included in that, they are contributing $2,000 to their HSA, and their company has a program where if you do sign up for a high deductible plan that is eligible for an HSA, they will contribute $1,000 to that HSA yearly. So that's where all of this is coming from. You'll be able to get these numbers obviously from your W-2 and that final paycheck, what exactly your gross income is. It's probably not going to be these nice of numbers, but for simplicity's sake, that's what we're going to do. And then they also know you'll be able to calculate how much you contributed to your pre-tax accounts. That'll be on your pay stubs, and then basically just knowing the relationship of how much your employer is kicking in. This HSA contribution will also be on your pay stub, and then once again, knowing the policies in your company of what your employer is contributing. So that's how we come up with these numbers. Taxes, this once again, you can add up all of your taxes, federal, state, and FICA, which is Social Security and Medicare. That will be all on your W-2 statement, or like I said, that last paycheck. And so for this person, it's $9,900. All right. And this couple is actually working on paying off debt. So they are not currently contributing to a Roth IRA. They've decided that they're going to contribute up to the match on their 401k, but they're not going to do any more investing. They're currently, paying off student loans and a car loan and that sort of thing. So the debt principal repayments, from those statements, they figured out that just allocating it to either spouse you can really do. They're adding $10,000 for debt principal repayments that they're allocating to this spouse. So that leaves you with a $20,000 consumption, essentially. And this is just for the first spouse. Now for the next spouse, they make $35,000 per year. And the setup with their employer is that if they add 4% of their gross income, their company will match dollar for dollar 4%. So that's $1,400, and their employer is matching $1,400. And once again, we're now on spouse two's W-2s, last pay stubs, that sort of thing. They don't have the healthcare, so we don't include any of the HSA matching or HSA contributions here because they aren't eligible for a plan. They don't have healthcare through their employer. But they definitely did pay taxes, and that was $5,300. Once again, they're not contributing to Roth because they're focusing on debt repayment, and $4,000 is attributed to spouse two. So what can we tell from these numbers? First off, down here, we inputted their gross income, and then it also tallies up that total compensation. So the gross income's $85,000, but that total compensation's closer to $90,000. All right. And then after all of these obligations and taxes and debt repayment, basically what they have to live off of after that is $44,400. So you can see that they have a lot of money going toward all of these other things, and this is left for rent would fall under this because if they're renting and they aren't adding principal to a property, that would fall under there. Obviously, any groceries and that sort of thing, that would have to come out of this consumption. So they're basically living on $44,000 a year. This would also include any sinking funds. Just because it says consumption does not mean that they are actually spending all of that. That just means that this is left to be consumed if desired after all of these obligations are taken care of. So ideally, you're still not spending all of this because you're just saving up for larger purchases and just emergency funds and having money around for a rainy day. So let's get into some of these savings rates real quick. And this article up here goes into these in a little bit more detail. So as Sam has pointed out, a lot of people are not interested in these savings rates necessarily, and I'm one of the few people interested in them. So I'm going to give a brief overview of what each of them is and is calculating, and my recommendations for what you should be looking at just to monitor progress. So savings rate 1, this divides all the savings by the total compensation. So here's what I was talking about up here, is that oftentimes we're only talking about gross income, which would be, just S2, S3, taxes, deductions, and consumption. That's how that's categorized, basically. It's all color-coded. You wouldn't necessarily have this S1 in there if you were looking at gross income. But here we've decided to look at total compensation. So just because this matching wasn't part of that it wasn't part of that gross income, we're still putting it in the denominator here just to more fully represent the fact that you are still being compensated almost $90,000 instead of $85,000. So it's a little bit more on the conservative side. Obviously, if you took this number out of the bottom, this percentage would increase, because you're decreasing the denominator, this percentage would increase. But let's just, I think for math's sake, and it makes sense to really still include that total compensation in that denominator. So that's what this one's doing. So you can see here that just basically how we have mostly the debt, principal repayments and other HSA things allocated. If you're just looking at spouse number 1, they're at a 38% savings rate with this calculation. Spouse 2 is at 18.7. The combined is at 30. Okay, good to know. And this is where I'm talking about how it's easier to calculate for one spouse, but for 2 of them together, this spreadsheet is a little bit easier to use. Savings rate 2 is basically based on take-home pay, your net income. So that's S3 plus the consumption is the only thing in the denominator, but you're still including your employee matching and then your contributions pre-tax. And you can see that savings rate is a lot higher, obviously because this denominator is much smaller. And basically the argument against the savings rate is that theoretically you could have over 100%. If you decide to invest everything in your gross income and you still got matching, this would be over 100%. So it gets kind of goofy. It really starts to skew things a bit. Obviously, if it's at 46%, that is very aggressive. I mean, the spouse 1 is at 68%. It's really extreme. So the recommended savings rate to look at is savings rate 3 generally. At least based on this article, essentially, and I think that I agree that I like it too. It's taking out taxes. You can do what you can to decrease your taxes, but you don't have a whole lot of control over them. So it's really focusing on the things that you have control over, choosing which healthcare plan you want to use, and then obviously all the savings that you're doing. So basically we're taking out taxes and focusing on that rate. So you can see here that it's obviously lower than savings rate 2, but higher than savings rate 1 where we're including those taxes. So this is a great one to see, wow, we are at a savings rate of almost 37%. That's what we're putting towards debt and paying that off. I mean, that is fantastic. And I think that this is an important one for people that especially are paying off debt, just to see all the work that you're doing, because you might not be contributing 15% to your retirement, but you can look and see here, they're putting $14,000 a year to principal payments, as well as what they are contributing to their retirement. So that's a really great number. Savings rate 4 is based on after-tax total compensation and adjusting for taxes. So that's not calculated here, and it isn't really a useful one. And I'll get into a different way to actually take into account taxes, meaning different ways of investing, pre-tax, post-tax, and accounting for the fact that $500 in a Roth IRA, which has already had the taxes paid on it, would technically be probably worth more than $500 in a 401k, which is pre-tax, because both of those will grow and you won't ever have to pay taxes on the Roth IRA again, but you will have to pay taxes on the 401k. So it weights it a little bit differently. So that one's just thrown in here because it's in the article. Okay, savings rate 5 down here is the one that I added. It's basically how much are you investing for retirement based on your total compensation. So once again, we're not using that gross income necessarily. That's what a lot of people at least categorize and encourage you to use is 15% of your gross income, but I think that it really makes more sense to still include that matching in the denominator. You're aiming for at least 15%. This calculation is the same as savings rate 1, but not all of the savings categories count toward this. So essentially, what it's not including right now are those HSA categories. So this one and this one, because unless you are investing your HSA for retirement, these are savings that you're doing, and those are good, but it's not necessarily counting towards your investment for retirement. So you'll see down here that we're at 14%, 7.7% for the next spouse, and then 11.5% combined. So they're definitely under that 15% goal. But as we talked about before, they're really focusing on paying off debt. So they've contributed up to the max match on their employer pre-tax contributions. They've decided to forego any Roth accounts, and they're really throwing a lot at debt. But you can see here that, once the debt has been eliminated, let's just pretend that, so they were contributing $14,000 to debt principal repayments. Let's just say that they're maxing out their Roth IRAs. And in 2019, as I'm recording this, the max that you can contribute to a Roth IRA is $6,000 or up to the amount of income that you earned. So obviously they each earned way more than $6,000. So we're just going to contribute those maxes. And let's say that they're out of debt and they don't have any more debt repayments. So with that simple change of basically getting rid of this 14 grand here and moving that 12 grand here because that's the maximum you can contribute, that pushes their investing rate to almost 25%. So that is way above that 15. And I think that it's really encouraging that even if you aren't hitting this 15% down here while you're paying off debt, playing around with it and seeing what those debt payments do, even if you don't want to put all of the money that you were putting to debt toward retirement, you can play around with it and see what that would do. And I think that it's really encouraging when you know that you're going to need to be saving that much and you're like, how the heck am I ever going to make that happen? Playing around with this spreadsheet a little bit, I think, can give you some clarity and know that once this cash is freed up, we can start to put it towards retirement, and having some idea of how much will be freed up after retirement and, vacations that you can plan or saving for a child's education and other things that you can do with that money. So that is my introduction to this spreadsheet. Another one that I really like, and this is getting advanced and even more into the weeds, but I think is a fantastic way to calculate this, because so many of these calculators, and it might just be me loving numbers, so many of these calculators don't account for the tax consequences of the retirement vehicles that you're in. So once again, if you're contributing pre-tax, you're not taxed now, but you will be taxed later. And then if you're contributing to a Roth account, you're taxed now, but your growth and principal won't be taxed later. So this is a calculator from Vanguard that is fairly hard to find. I don't really know why, but it's hard to find. Luckily, I had it bookmarked. You just put in a lot of this information, basically to figure out, your time horizon and some of the tax information that you have. So date of birth, current salary, pay frequency, marital status, tax withholding, expected retirement age, expected retirement income. This is where you can put in, say we have $5,000 coming in a month and we want to have $4,000 coming in retirement. So you'd say, I want to have 80% of my expected income. Anything that you have right now, you would put in here for that you already have saved for retirement. Expected annual return. This we just talked about in the compounding interest and fees video. That 7% is fairly reasonable, obviously depending on that asset allocation. You can also tell it to include Social Security. And I'm not going to go into all of this. I'm telling you that it exists in case you want to play around with it and you really want to get into the tax implications. So obviously you input your pre-tax contribution, your Roth contribution, any other after-tax contribution. And then if you're increasing it automatically each year, until it hits a certain number, any employer match stuff, you can see that it's very comprehensive, and it'll start calculating over here basically the goal that you have and then how much you will have based on these numbers. And this is basically your current plan now, and it allows you to change it. If you want to tweak things and figure out how much income you'd have per month if you increased your Roth contribution by a percentage or something like that. So this starts to capture a little bit more of the taxes, and this is definitely on the advanced side and only for people that are probably diehards with calculating all of this. Now you might be thinking, Emily, this is too complicated. I don't care this much. I'm just going to get a financial advisor and they're just going to do this for me. I can understand this being overwhelming. Sam has told me on multiple occasions that the spreadsheet is a bit overwhelming for somebody that isn't a spreadsheet geek. But I hope that by walking you through this and just figuring out, where these numbers are coming from, It'll really paint a good picture of your financial situation. And yeah, it is a fair amount of work, but if you just want to do it, once at the end of the year, it might take an hour or so. And then you'll have this set up, and then you can start to plan out the next year. And okay, this is what we did this year. These are the goals that we hit. Here's where I want to focus this year. You can use it to plan. But I don't think it's too bad. And really, even if you had a financial advisor, they're not going to go this in depth. It really comes back to you being in charge of your finances. And I think that especially down here, seeing this consumption number, let's say they decided to not contribute to their Roths. They go, okay, we're going to live on $58,000 per year, which I think is an awful lot of money, personally. And really just deciding what your priorities are and figuring out what you want to live on. I think it's an important part of this spreadsheet to see all of these numbers laid out and seeing how much you have to live on after and deciding if that's really how much you want to spend. I'll be getting into an episode on lifestyle inflation. We're basically talking about, especially from college to when you just start working, the lifestyle inflation that happens. You go from living on barely anything to, maybe getting a $50,000 paycheck and thinking that you're rich. And suddenly wants turn into needs. Things that were previously luxuries turn into, oh, I can't live without this. And that's okay to an extent, but I think that it's good to reel it back in and figure out what you actually need to be happy and fulfilled and making sure that you're still reaching those goals. So that's where I think this consumption number comes in, is seeing like, oh, okay, we're living on $58,000. Do we really need that much? Could we be more aggressive in goals? Could we work to do stuff now? I know right now, especially with Sam and I not having kids, it's like, what do we need to live on? We don't need a whole lot. Like, we can ratchet it down a little bit. There's only 2 of us, and we have that fairly under control. And it allows us to be more aggressive with other goals. So that's the point of the spreadsheet, is that once again, I think that you need to be taking charge of your financial future and making informed decisions and really seeing these numbers on paper. And, I don't know if that'll be a lot to you or a little, but just facing those numbers and having it all in one place. And then pick a savings rate 3. So we saved 17.8 in 2018. So you can input that here. And it'll be down there, and say you want to hit 25% the following year, and you do end up hitting it and stuff. So you can see just this little graphic of tracking that savings rate and seeing your progress. Obviously, some years will be better than others, but once again, keeping that data and understanding where you've come from and the goals you're working towards, and really tracking it, because this is not one of those things that you can do unintentionally. This spreadsheet is absolutely an act of intention. And I think that especially at the beginning for investing and even paying off debt, you have to be intentional. So confront these numbers, understand what the numbers are, and really get familiar with that W-2 and that final pay stub and what all is coming into the house, and being in charge of it, directing it where you want to go. So that is it for the savings rate. And once again, oftentimes people just say invest 15%, but I wanted to get into an actual tool that you could use to track this and track your progress. So action items for this: calculate your savings rate from 2018. I just walked through that and what you need to do to calculate that, see where you were at. And then once again, analyze your budget. If you look at that consumption total and go, oh my gosh, we are living on a lot of money. It seems like a lot of money, seeing it sit there. Maybe we can put it to better use. Or you look at it and go, hokey smokes, this is maybe part of the reason why we've been struggling, is that we're only left with $20,000 after all of these other obligations. Going back to your budget and seeing what you can possibly cut, how you can reallocate money, making sure that it is aligning with your priorities. And once again, the resources, I have that Vanguard calculator, more focusing on taxes. And then there are quite a few Fidelity articles on how much do I need to save to retire, a similar one from Vanguard. And I'll be linking to the Drive Excel sheet that we just walked through. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to discussing financial advisors with you next week, which, just a warning, might stir up some controversy. And I can't wait to hear your feedback and all of that. And feel free to tell me that I'm crazy or that you disagree with me or something like that. But I'm looking forward to it. Thank you.
Advisor bashing party.